The summer sun beat down on Maple Street as the scent of grilling burgers wafted through the air. The Martinez family's annual 4th of July barbecue was in full swing, with laughter and chatter filling their backyard. Little did they know that this cherished tradition was about to become the epicenter of a neighborhood conflict that would expose long-simmering tensions and ultimately reveal an unexpected twist. Carlos Martinez stood at the grill, expertly flipping patties as his wife Maria set out colorful plates of corn on the cob and potato salad. Their children, Alex and Sophia, darted between clusters of relatives and friends, their excited giggles punctuating the festive atmosphere. It was a scene of pure suburban bliss, one that Carlos had worked tirelessly to create for his family since moving to this quiet cul-de-sac 3 years ago. But not everyone on Maple Street welcomed the Martinez family with open arms. As the party hit its stride, a commotion erupted at the front of the house. Carlos's smile faded as he heard a familiar voice raised in anger. With a sigh, he handed the spatula to his brother-in-law and made his way through the throng of confused guests. There, on the sidewalk, stood Harold Thompson, the thorn in the Martinez family's side since day one. The retired accountant's face was flushed red, not from the heat, but from the fury that seemed to consume him whenever he laid eyes on his Latino neighbors. "This has gone on long enough," Harold bellowed, jabbing a bony finger in Carlos's direction. "You people and your loud music, the smell of your food, it's bringing down property values." A hush fell over the gathering as guests crowded around to witness the confrontation. Carlos took a deep breath, determined to keep his cool despite the familiar sting of Harold's words. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but never so openly, never in front of his entire family and friend group. "Mr. Thompson," Carlos began, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "We've been over this. We have every right to celebrate with our loved ones. If you have concerns, we can discuss them civilly another time." But Harold was beyond reason. Spittle flew from his mouth as he ranted about noise ordinances and threatened to call the police. Some of the guests began to murmur uneasily, while others stepped forward to defend the Martinez family. The joyous atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick tension that seemed to crackle in the air. As the situation escalated, Maria appeared at Carlos's side, her eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Enough," she said firmly, addressing Harold. "You've made your feelings clear time and time again, but this ends today." There was something in Maria's tone that gave even Harold pause. She turned to the gathered crowd, her voice rising with emotion. "Friends, family, I'm sorry you had to witness this, but maybe it's time everyone knew the truth about our neighbor Mr. Thompson." Carlos's eyes widened in surprise. What truth? He thought he knew everything about their ongoing feud with Harold, but the look on his wife's face told him there was more to the story. Much more. Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. Harold Thompson isn't just a grumpy old man with outdated views. He's... But before Maria could finish her sentence, a commotion from down the street drew everyone's attention. A police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their faces grim as they approached the group. "We received a noise complaint," one officer announced, eyeing the crowd warily. "Is there a problem here?" The moment hung in the balance. Carlos and Maria exchanged a loaded glance, silently debating how to proceed. Harold, for his part, looked triumphant, certain that his threats had finally come to fruition. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, a voice rang out, one that Carlos recognized as belonging to Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who lived across the street. "Officers," she said, her voice quavering but determined, "I think there's something you need to know about Mr. Thompson and his history in this neighborhood." A ripple of whispers spread through the gathering. Even Harold's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of what looked almost like fear. As Mrs. Chen made her way to the front of the group, Carlos felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever was about to be revealed, he realized, would change life on Maple Street forever. The annual 4th of July barbecue had become the stage for a long-overdue reckoning, one that would force everyone present to confront their own biases and assumptions. The officers looked from Mrs. Chen to Harold, then back to Carlos and Maria. "All right," the lead officer said, pulling out a notepad. "Let's hear what's really going on here." And so, as fireworks began to pop in the distance, celebrating America's independence, the residents of Maple Street prepared to grapple with a different kind of independence, freedom from the prejudices and secrets that had divided them for far too long. Carlos took Maria's hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As Mrs. Chen began to speak, her words carried on the warm summer breeze. Carlos couldn't help but wonder, how would their lives change once the truth was finally laid bare? And more importantly, would their tight-knit community survive the revelation? The story of the 4th of July barbecue that changed everything was just beginning to unfold, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Maple Street, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Mrs. Chen's voice quivered as she began to speak, her eyes fixed on Harold Thompson. "I've lived on this street for over 40 years, she said. "I've seen families come and go, watched children grow up. But I've also seen the darker side of our community, the side we don't like to talk about." The gathered crowd leaned in, hanging on her every word. Even the police officers, who had arrived ready to break up a noisy party, now stood transfixed by the unfolding drama. "Mr. Thompson wasn't always the angry man you see today," Mrs. Chen continued. "When he first moved here with his family, he was different. Quieter, perhaps, but not unkind. It wasn't until the Jacksons moved in next door to him that things changed." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening air. He'd heard whispers about the Jacksons, an African-American family who had lived on Maple Street briefly before the Martinez family arrived. But he'd never known the full story. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath before continuing. "The Jacksons were good people. Their children played with ours, they kept their home beautiful. But Harold, he couldn't see past the color of their skin." The comments started small at first, snide remarks at neighborhood meetings, complaints about imaginary noise. But it escalated. As Mrs. Chen spoke, Carlos noticed Harold's face growing paler by the second. The man who had been so full of righteous anger just moments ago now looked small, almost frail. One night, Mrs. Chen said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper, there was an incident. Vandalism, horrible racist graffiti on the Jacksons' house. We all suspected, but no one could prove. She trailed off, but the implication was clear. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Carlos felt Maria's hand tighten in his own. One of the police officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you saying Mr. Thompson was responsible for a hate crime?" Before Mrs. Chen could respond, another voice cut through the tense silence. It wasn't just vandalism. All eyes turned to see Brian Foster, a high school history teacher who lived 2 doors down, step forward. "I was just a kid then, but I remember that summer. The accidents that kept happening to the Jacksons' property, the threatening phone calls. It got so bad they eventually moved away." Harold, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found his voice. "You can't prove any of that," he sputtered, his face now ashen. "This is slander, all of it." But the floodgates had opened. More neighbors stepped forward, sharing long-buried memories of that turbulent time. The picture they painted was one of a community paralyzed by fear and complacency, allowing hatred to fester unchecked. As the stories unfolded, Carlos couldn't help but draw parallels to his own family's experiences since moving to Maple Street. The cold shoulders, the whispered comments, the sense of always being watched, it all took on a new, more sinister meaning. Maria, sensing his distress, squeezed his hand. "This isn't just about us anymore," she whispered. "This is bigger than our family." Carlos nodded, realizing she was right. The annual barbecue had become a catalyst for long overdue change. But as he looked around at the shocked and angry faces of his neighbors, he wondered if their community could survive the weight of these revelations. The police officers, looking increasingly uncomfortable, huddled together in quiet discussion. Finally, the lead officer addressed the crowd. "Clearly, there's more going on here than a simple noise complaint. We'll need statements from everyone involved." Harold, seeing the tide turning against him, attempted to make a hasty retreat. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, backing away. "You can't believe these people over me. I'm a respected member of this community." But his words rang hollow. The mask had slipped, revealing the ugliness that had lurked beneath the surface for so long. As Harold turned to leave, he found his path blocked by an unexpected figure. Alex, Carlos and Maria's teenage son, stood before him, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and determination. "Mr. Thompson," Alex said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly bubbling beneath the surface, "I got something to say to you." A hush fell over the gathering. Carlos felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. He and Maria had raised their children to stand up for what was right, but confronting a grown man, especially one as volatile as Harold, was no small feat. Alex took a deep breath before continuing. "Every day since we moved here, I've watched you glare at my family. I've heard the things you say when you think we can't hear. And you know what? It hurt. It made me feel like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood." Harold's face twisted into a sneer, but before he could interrupt, Alex pressed on. "But then I realized something. The problem isn't with me or my family. It's with you. You're so caught up in hate that you can't see what you're missing out on. You don't know how awesome my dad's grilling is, or how my mom makes everyone feel welcome. You don't know that I just made honor roll, or that my sister volunteers at the animal shelter." Alex's words seemed to strike a chord with many in the crowd. Nods of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Carlos saw several neighbors wipe away tears. "So yeah," Alex concluded, his voice growing stronger, "you can keep being angry if you want. But you're the one who's going to end up alone. The rest of us, we're going to keep coming together, keep celebrating, keep being a real community. And you're welcome to join us, if you're ready to open your mind and your heart." For a moment, the only sound was the distant pop of fireworks. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, growing into a thunderous ovation. Carlos pulled Alex into a fierce hug, his heart swelling with pride. As the clapping died down, all eyes turned once again to Harold. The man who had seemed so formidable just hours ago now looked deflated, almost lost. For a brief moment, Carlos thought he saw a flicker of something: regret? Shame? Cross Harold's face, but then the familiar scowl returned. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Harold muttered, pushing past Alex and storming off down the street. As they watched him go, Carlos felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief that the truth had finally come to light, anger at the years of prejudice his family had endured, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a turning point for their community. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting decades of ingrained bias and hidden prejudices would take more than one dramatic showdown. As the neighbors began to disperse, talking in hushed, excited tones about the evening's events, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. What would tomorrow bring? How would this revelation change the dynamic on Maple Street? And most pressingly, what was the secret that Maria had been about to reveal before Mrs. Chen spoke up? As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky and the sound of fireworks grew louder, Carlos knew one thing for certain: life on Maple Street would never be the same again. The question was, would it change for the better? As the night wore on, the Martinez family's once festive backyard became a hub of intense discussions. Neighbors who had barely spoken beyond polite hellos were now engrossed in deep conversations, sharing stories and confronting uncomfortable truths about their community's past. Carlos found himself in the middle of it all, fielding questions and trying to process the evening's revelations. He couldn't help but notice the way some neighbors looked at him differently now, with a mixture of guilt, sympathy, and something that looked almost like admiration. Maria, meanwhile, had retreated to the kitchen, busying herself with cleaning up. Carlos knew his wife well enough to recognize when she needed space to think. Whatever secret she had been about to reveal about Harold Thompson was clearly weighing heavily on her mind. As the last of the guests trickled out, promising to stay in touch and continue the important conversations that had begun that night, Carlos finally had a moment alone with Maria. He found her standing at the sink, staring out the window into the darkness. "Hey," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You want to talk about what happened out there?" Maria turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Carlos, I don't know if I did the right thing. Maybe I should have just kept quiet." Carlos pulled her into a hug, feeling the tension in her body. "What do you mean? What were you going to say about Thompson?" before Mrs. Chen spoke up. Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Do you remember last month when I was working late at the community center? I overheard a conversation. Harold was there, arguing with someone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but..." She trailed off, and Carlos waited patiently for her to continue. Whatever Maria had heard, it was clearly something big. He was talking about selling his house, Maria finally said. But not to just anyone. He said he had found a buyer who would keep the neighborhood the way it should be. Carlos, I think he's been actively trying to prevent diverse families from moving onto Maple Street. Carlos felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of sadness. The depth of Harold's prejudice seemed to know no bounds. We have to do something, he said. We can't let him manipulate who gets to live here. Maria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. There's more, she said quietly. I think he might have dirt on some of the other neighbors. He mentioned something about keeping people in line. What if exposing him makes things worse for everyone? As they grappled with this new information, a soft knock at the back door startled them. Alex poked his head in, his face uncharacteristically serious. Mom, Dad, there's something you need to see. Exchanging worried glances, Carlos and Maria followed their son out into the yard. A small group had gathered near the fence, whispering urgently. As they approached, Carlos saw what had caught everyone's attention. A crude, threatening message had been spray-painted across their back fence. Go back where you came from, the red letters screamed in the darkness. Carlos felt his stomach drop. He dealt with prejudice before, but never something so blatant, so close to home. He instinctively moved to shield Maria and Alex, even as he knew the real damage had already been done. I called the police, Brian Foster said, stepping forward. This is unacceptable. After everything that came out tonight, for someone to do this. As if on cue, the whoop of a police siren cut through the night air, but instead of bringing relief, it only added to the tension. Would the police take this seriously, or would they dismiss it as a prank, another misunderstanding in a long line of incidents the Martinez family had endured? As they waited for the patrol car to arrive, Carlos noticed movement across the street. Harold Thompson stood in his driveway, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. For a moment, their eyes met, and Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. Was this Harold's doing? A retaliation for the events of the barbecue? Or was there someone else in the neighborhood harboring such hateful views? The police car pulled up, and two officers, different from the ones who had responded earlier, stepped out. As they approached, Carlos felt Maria's hand slip into his own. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. But even as he drew strength from his family's presence, Carlos couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The revelation of Maple Street's troubled history had brought long-buried issues to the surface. Now, with this act of vandalism, it was clear that the past was far from buried. As the officers began to take statements, Carlos's mind raced. How could they prove who was behind this? How could they make their home feel safe again? And most importantly, how could they turn this ugly incident into an opportunity for real, lasting change in their community? The night air crackled with tension as neighbors gathered, some offering support, others watching warily from a distance. Carlos knew that the coming days would be crucial. The true character of Maple Street was about to be tested, and the outcome would shake their lives for years to come. As he stood there, arm around Maria, watching the police shine flashlights on the hateful message, Carlos made a silent vow. He wouldn't let fear win. He wouldn't let hatred drive his family from their home. Whatever it took, he would fight for justice, for acceptance, for the right to belong. The battle for Maple Street had only just begun, and Carlos Martinez was determined to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. The days following the 4th of July incident passed in a blur of police reports, neighborhood meetings, and hushed conversations. The vandalism at the Martinez house had shaken the community to its core, forcing residents to confront the ugliness that had been festering beneath Maple Street's picturesque surface. Carlos threw himself into action, organizing a neighborhood watch program and reaching out to local civil rights organizations for support. He was determined to turn this crisis into an opportunity for positive change. But with each step forward, it felt like they were pushed 2 steps back. Anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes, warning of property values plummeting and the character of the neighborhood changing. Carlos couldn't prove it, but he was certain Harold Thompson was behind them. The retired accountant had been suspiciously quiet since the barbecue, watching from the sidelines as tensions in the community rose. Maria, meanwhile, grappled with the weight of the secret she carried. The knowledge of Harold's attempts to manipulate home sales on Maple Street gnawed at her. She knew she should come forward, but fear held her back. What if exposing Harold's schemes made things worse for her family? As the summer heat intensified, so did the pressure on Maple Street. The community found itself divided into factions: those who supported the Martinez family and pushed for change, those who sided with Harold and his old guard, an uncertain middle group who just wanted things to go back to normal, whatever that meant. The situation came to a head on a sweltering August afternoon. Carlos was in the front yard, touching up the paint on their mailbox, scrubbing away yet another racial slur, when he heard raised voices coming from down the street. Heart pounding, he jogged towards the commotion, only to find a crowd gathering outside the Foster house. Brian Foster stood on his front porch, face red with anger, squaring off against Harold Thompson and a group of other neighbors. "You can't do this," Brian was shouting. "You can't just force people out because you don't like the color of their skin." Harold's voice was calmer, but no less menacing. "Nobody's forcing anyone, Brian. We're simply concerned about maintaining certain standards in our community. If some people can't meet those standards, well..." Carlos pushed his way through the crowd, piecing together what was happening. The Fosters had been planning to sell their house to a young interracial couple, a move that Harold and his supporters were trying to block. "This ends now," Carlos said, his voice cutting through the chaos. All eyes turned to him. "Harold, we know what you've been doing. We know about your preferred buyers and your threats. It stops today." A hush fell over the gathering. Harold's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You're nothing but trouble, you and your kind. This neighborhood was perfect before you came along." The crowd's reaction was mixed, some nodding in agreement with Harold, others looking ashamed at his blatant racism. Carlos felt a mixture of anger and sadness wash over him. How had it come to this? Just then, Maria's voice rang out from behind him. "Actually, Harold, we know everything." Carlos turned to see his wife striding towards them, a determined look on her face. In her hand, she clutched a folder. "I didn't want to do this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I hoped we could work things out as neighbors, as human beings. But you've left us no choice." She opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. Emails, recorded conversations, financial records, all showing how you've been manipulating property sales on this street for years. Steering certain buyers away, pressuring others to sell. It's all here. Harold's face went pale. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't prove anything." "Oh, but we can," came another voice. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame radiating determination. "I've been keeping my own records, Harold. Every incident, every accident, every family that was pushed out. I thought I was powerless to stop it back then, but not anymore." The atmosphere on the street was electric. Neighbors whispered urgently to each other, some looking shocked, others nodding as if pieces of a long unsolved puzzle were finally falling into place. Harold looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. His supporters were backing away, not meeting his eyes. "This is slander," he shouted. "I'll sue all of you." But his threats rang hollow. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Suddenly, the wail of police sirens cut through the air. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner, lights flashing. Carlos felt his heart rate spike. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of Maple Street. As the officers approached, time seemed to slow down. Carlos looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some fearful, some angry, some hopeful. He saw Alex and Sophia watching from their front yard, worry etched on their young faces. He felt Maria's hand slip into his own, squeezing tight. Whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The truth was finally coming to light, but at what cost? And more importantly, would it be enough to heal the deep wounds that had been festering in their community for so long? As the police officers stepped out of their cars, the tension on Maple Street reached its breaking point. The fate of their neighborhood hung in the balance, and everyone present knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the police officers approached, a hush fell over the crowd. Carlos felt his heart pounding, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of months of tension, fear, and hope. But just as the lead officer opened his mouth to speak, a commotion erupted from the back of the gathering. A figure pushed through the crowd, moving with urgent purpose. To everyone's shock, it was Harold's wife, Eleanor Thompson, a woman who had been conspicuously absent from neighborhood affairs for years. "Wait!" Eleanor cried out, her voice trembling but determined. "There's something you all need to know." All eyes turned to her, including Harold's, whose face had drained of all color. Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Harold isn't acting alone," she began, her words sending a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "There's a group, influential people in the city, who've been orchestrating this segregation, not just here on Maple Street, but across the whole town." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Carlos felt Maria's hand tighten in his own as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about their neighborhood anymore, it was something far bigger and more insidious. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "They call themselves the Heritage Preservation Council. On the surface, they claim to protect the town's history and character. But in reality, they're manipulating property sales, influencing local politics, even pressuring businesses, all to keep certain people out and others in their place." The police officers exchanged glances, clearly realizing that what had seemed like a neighborhood dispute was rapidly evolving into something much more serious. Harold, who had been silent until now, suddenly found his voice. "Eleanor, shut up," he hissed, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. "You don't know what you're doing." But Eleanor stood her ground. "No, Harold, I've been silent for too long. What we've been part of, it's wrong. And it ends today." As if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed man stepped out, his very presence exuding authority and menace. Carlos recognized him immediately. Jonathan Blackwell, a prominent real estate developer and one of the most powerful men in town. "What's going on here?" Blackwell demanded, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on Harold. "Thompson, I thought you said you had this situation under control." The pieces were falling into place now. Carlos remembered seeing Blackwell at town council meetings, always pushing for zoning changes that seemed innocuous at the time. Now, with Eleanor's revelation, a sinister pattern was emerging. Blackwell's arrival seemed to embolden Harold. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Just a neighborly dispute that got out of hand. Nothing for anyone to worry about." But the damage was done, the truth was out, and the residents of Maple Street were realizing that they had been pawns in a much larger game. Brian Foster stepped forward, his face set with determination. "No more lies, Harold. No more manipulation. We want the truth. All of it." The tension in the air was palpable. Carlos could see the fear and uncertainty on his neighbors' faces, but also a growing resolve. They had been divided for too long, and now, faced with a common enemy, they were coming together. Blackwell's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of panic. He reached into his jacket, perhaps for a phone, but one of the police officers stepped forward, hand on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them." As the officer began to read Blackwell his rights, Carlos felt a tugging on his sleeve. He looked down to see Alex, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Dad," he whispered, "I think I found something." Carlos followed his son's gaze to a manila envelope partially hidden under a nearby bush. How long had that been there? And more importantly, what was inside? As he bent to retrieve it, Carlos felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Whatever was in that envelope, he realized, could change everything. The future of Maple Street, and perhaps the entire town, hung in the balance. With trembling hands, Carlos opened the envelope. As he scanned its contents, his eyes widened. This was it, the smoking gun they needed. But as he looked up at the tense faces surrounding him, a new fear gripped his heart. How far would Blackwell and his associates go to keep their secrets buried? The summer air crackled with tension as Carlos stood at the center of the storm, holding proof of a conspiracy that went far beyond anything they had imagined. The true battle for justice on Maple Street was only just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. Carlos's hands trembled as he held the envelope's contents. A stack of documents that laid bare the entire conspiracy. Contracts, emails, and financial records painted a damning picture of the Heritage Preservation Council's true nature. It was all there, evidence of discriminatory housing practices, political bribes, and a web of deceit that stretched from Maple Street to City Hall. "Everyone needs to see this," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He began to read aloud, his words cutting through the tense silence. As the truth unfolded, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had been at odds for months now stood united in their shock and outrage. The scale of the deception was staggering. Blackwell's composure crumbled. "This is absurd," he sputtered, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "Thompson, do something." But Harold Thompson was a broken man. He slumped to the curb, head in his hands, as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. Eleanor knelt beside him, her face a mixture of sorrow and relief. The police officers, realizing the magnitude of what they were dealing with, called for backup. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived, along with detectives and even a couple of FBI agents who had been investigating related cases in neighboring towns. As Blackwell was led away in handcuffs, protesting loudly about his connections and his lawyers, a cheer went up from the residents of Maple Street. It was a cathartic release of months of tension and fear. But Carlos knew their work was far from over. "This is just the beginning," he said, addressing his neighbors. "We've exposed the truth, but now we have to rebuild. We have to make Maple Street, and our entire town, a place where everyone is truly welcome." The response was immediate and heartening. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now embracing, making plans to repaint the Martinez's vandalized fence together. Mrs. Chen offered to host a weekly community dinner to bring everyone closer. Even some of Harold's former supporters stepped forward, shamefaced but sincere in their desire to make amends. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene, Carlos felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Brian Foster, looking both exhausted and exhilarated. "I just got off the phone with Aisha and Michael," he said, referring to the young interracial couple he had been trying to sell his house to. "I told them everything that happened. They still want to move here. Said they'd be proud to be part of a community that stands up for what's right." Carlos felt a lump in his throat. This was what they had been fighting for, not just tolerance, but true acceptance and unity. But just as it seemed the day's drama was winding down, a sleek news van pulled up to the curb. A familiar face stepped out. Diana Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter and a rising star reporter for the local news station. "Mom?" Diana called out, looking confused and concerned. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Chen stepped forward, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Oh, Diana," she said with a smile, "have I got a story for you?" Suddenly, Carlos understood. Mrs. Chen hadn't just been keeping records of the neighborhood's troubled history. She had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to bring it all to light. And now, with her daughter's help, the truth about Maple Street would reach far beyond their neighborhood. As Diana set up her camera and began interviewing residents, Carlos felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their story would be told, but what would the consequences be? How would their quiet suburban life change once it became national news? Maria squeezed his hand, sensing his unease. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "we'll face it together. All of us." Carlos looked around at his neighbors, no, his friends, and felt a surge of hope. Maple Street had been through the fire, but they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Carlos realized that this wasn't just the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of something new. A community reborn, committed to justice and equality. And as Diana's camera light flickered on, illuminating the diverse faces of Maple Street's residents, Carlos knew that their story had the power to inspire change far beyond their little corner of the world. The battle for Maple Street was over, but the real work, the work of building a truly inclusive community, was just beginning. And for the first time in months, Carlos couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. As Diana Chen's news report hit the airwaves, the story of Maple Street spread like wildfire. What had begun as a local dispute quickly became a national conversation about discrimination, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. The residents of Maple Street found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their experiences resonating with people across the country. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The physical changes were visible. Freshly painted fences, new families moving in, community gardens sprouting up in once neglected lots. But the most profound shifts were happening beneath the surface, in the hearts and minds of the residents. Carlos and Maria's home became an unofficial headquarters for the neighborhood's renewal efforts. Their living room hosted nightly meetings where people shared ideas, worked through lingering tensions, and planned for a better future. It wasn't always easy. Old habits and prejudices didn't disappear overnight, but the willingness to listen and learn was palpable. Harold Thompson, facing legal consequences for his role in the Heritage Preservation Council's schemes, made an unexpected move. In a tear-filled community meeting, he offered a full confession and a genuine apology. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I let fear and ignorance guide my actions, and I hurt so many people in the process. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to be part of making things right." The road to forgiveness would be long, but Harold's sincerity opened the door to healing. He volunteered to lead an initiative to review and rectify past discriminatory housing practices, working alongside civil rights lawyers to ensure justice for those who had been wronged. Mrs. Chen, now hailed as the neighborhood's unsung hero, found herself in high demand. Community groups from across the city sought her advice on building inclusive neighborhoods. She took it all in stride, hosting workshops on cultural understanding from her front porch, always with a plate of her famous dumplings at the ready. Alex and Sofia Martinez became leaders in their own right, starting a youth group dedicated to promoting diversity and equality. Their first project, a vibrant mural on the side of the community center, depicting faces of all colors coming together to form a beautiful mosaic. As summer turned to fall, Maple Street hosted its first ever multicultural festival. The event drew visitors from all over the city, transforming the once quiet suburb into a bustling celebration of diversity. Food stalls lined the street, offering everything from Maria's tamales to Mrs. Chen's dumplings to new resident Aisha's fragrant biryani. Music from various cultures filled the air, and impromptu dance lessons broke out on front lawns. Brian Foster, watching the festivities from his porch, couldn't help but smile. "You know," he said to Carlos, who had stopped by with a plate of food, "a few months ago, I was thinking of moving away. Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." The festival became an annual tradition, growing bigger and more inclusive each year. But more importantly, it served as a reminder of how far they had come and the work still to be done. The legal fallout from the Heritage Preservation Council scandal continued to unfold. Jonathan Blackwell and several city officials faced federal charges, their trial making headlines and sparking discussions about systemic discrimination across the country. But for the residents of Maple Street, justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about creating lasting change. They formed a community oversight committee to work with local government, ensuring transparent and fair housing practices. The committee, diverse in age, race, and background, became a model for other neighborhoods looking to promote equality and inclusion. Carlos, who had once felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood, now found himself as a respected community leader. He was invited to speak at schools and community centers, sharing the story of Maple Street's transformation and inspiring others to take a stand against discrimination. One crisp autumn evening, as Carlos walked home from one such speaking engagement, he paused at the entrance to Maple Street. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the houses, and the sound of children playing drifted on the breeze. He thought back to that fateful 4th of July barbecue that had set everything in motion. Deep in thought, a voice asked. Carlos turned to see Maria walking up, hand in hand with Mrs. Chen. "Just appreciating how far we've come," Carlos replied with a smile. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. "And yet, our journey is far from over. There will always be more work to do, more bridges to build. But we'll do it together," Maria added, squeezing Mrs. Chen's hand. As they walked down the street, neighbors called out greetings. The Fosters were helping the newly arrived Paddle family unpack their moving truck. Alex and his friends were planning their next community service project on the Johnsons' front steps. And there, tending to a small garden in front of his house, was Harold Thompson, working alongside Eleanor and a group of enthusiastic children. Carlos felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. This was what community meant, not just living side by side, but truly seeing and supporting one another through good times and bad. As they reached their own front yard, Carlos noticed a small package on the porch. Opening it, he found a framed photograph of the multicultural festival with a note attached. "To the residents of Maple Street, Your courage and compassion have shown us all what's possible when we stand together against hate. Thank you for leading the way. Diana Chen. Carlos handed the frame to Maria, who studied it with misty eyes. We should hang this in the community center, she said, to remind us of how far we've come and to inspire us to keep going. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. Every great journey begins with a single step. Maple Street has taken many steps forward, but our path stretches on. There will be challenges ahead, no doubt, but now we know the strength we possess when we stand united. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Carlos looked out at his neighborhood, at the faces of friends and allies where once he had seen only strangers and adversaries. He thought of all the stories yet to be told, all the connections yet to be made. You're right, he said, putting an arm around Maria and smiling at Mrs. Chen. Our journey isn't over, but whatever comes next, we'll face it the way we faced everything else, together. And with that, they walked into their home, leaving the door open and welcome, ready for whatever the future might bring to Maple Street, a place that had become more than just a neighborhood. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of unity, and a reminder that with courage, compassion, and understanding, even the deepest divisions can be healed. As night fell on Maple Street, the warm glow of porch lights illuminated a community forever changed. Not perfect, but ever striving, ever growing, and above all, ever welcoming to all who sought to call it home.